Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Tatro with RAECO Rents. I'm filling in for Matt Delacluse. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar. Before we get started, please note that a copy of today's webinar session will be emailed to you tomorrow, and a certificate for attending today will be emailed 1 hour after the webinar concludes. If for some reason you don't get that certificate, feel free to email us at webinars@raecorents.com and we will forward you a copy. Because of the large numbers of attendees, we will be muting the phone lines. If you have a question, there is a question chat tool built into GoToWebinar. Please enter your question and we will try to get them answered. Our presenter today is Dan Ochoa from Mobile Health Diagnostics. In this 60-minute free webinar, he will cover the following: fit testing overview, why our customers and we prefer quantitative fit testing, why we use the TSI PortaCount, how to set up and manage a fit testing program, why it's essential and why it's required, and how fit testing benefits employees and makes a safer workplace for all. Dan has spent his career in sales, marketing, R&D within the health and safety field. Dan started his career with W.S. Darley and Company as a sales manager with a focus on the fire and EMS industry. After leaving Darley, Dan worked as a regional sales director for Kimberly-Clark Global Safety with a focus on growing the health and safety product offerings and managing a sales team covering the upper Midwest. Over the past decade, Dan has worked as a manager at TSI with a focus on respiratory protection, and was instrumental to developing the fourth generation PortaCount. After leaving TSI, Dan co-founded Mobile Health Diagnostics. Mobile Health Diagnostics operates nationwide and provides OSHA compliance testing on site for its customers, and they currently provide OSHA required audiometric hearing testing, respiratory fit testing, noise level surveys, and air quality assessments. Dan resides in Denver, Colorado with his family, and he enjoys exploring the Rockies, off-roading, camping, skiing, canoeing, and he also loves to travel. We welcome Dan as our featured speaker, and we thank him for sharing his time and expertise with our customers today. Now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dan. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Amanda. Appreciate the introduction, and looking forward to presenting this presentation today. All right, so we'll jump right in. All right, so as Amanda mentioned, we are going to be going over respirator fit testing and a variety of different topics associated with that. Basically, objectives for today: just be able to identify situations where respirators might be necessary, understand why proper fit, usage, and maintenance are important, and how a proper respirator, respiratory protection program can help cover those points. Identify limitations and capabilities of different respirators. We'll go over qualitative versus quantitative fit testing, and why we at Mobile Health Diagnostics prefer quantitative fit testing. And then we'll go over setting up and managing a respiratory protection program, why we do fit testing annually, and then how respiratory protection programs can benefit not only your employees but the overall workplace. So we'll go from there. So what is a respirator? Most people have, especially since we're in COVID and kind of hopefully towards post-COVID, most everybody has a pretty good idea of what a respirator is. Basically, it's a personal protective device that is worn over the nose and mouth, and it covers at the very minimum the nose and mouth to protect the respiratory system from outside contaminants. Respirators are designed to reduce the wearer of the respirator, the risk of inhaling those airborne hazards, whether it's a substance or a virus or whatever it may be. And then all respirators in the U.S. are supposed to be NIOSH certified, and NIOSH is a branch of the CDC. One thing to keep in mind is that during COVID, as a lot of people experienced, there were supply chain issues with respirators, and OSHA And NIOSH did provide temporary guidance to different entities, including healthcare, that did allow use of other types of non potentially non NIOSH or CDC approved respirators for a temporary period. And to my knowledge, most of those have been pulled back at this point. So, if your organization does have respirators that were potentially out of compliance, you will want to take a look at your program and make sure you get clarity on that. So there are two main classes of respirators. The first is air purifying. An air purifying respirator is basically a respirator that has a filter cartridge, and it removes specific air contaminants by passing the ambient air, the air that's in the room or in the atmosphere, through a purifying element like a filter cartridge. And you can see on the screen the person with the hard hat, it appears, has an organic vapor cartridge because it's got kind of that olive color on there. So that would be a respirator that could be used, in an instance where there might be organic vapors present in the atmosphere. The other type of main respirator type is air supplying respirator, and that's basically a respirator that supplies the user with fresh breathing air from a source independent from the ambient air. So that'd be like an oxygen bottle, or air that's being drawn in through um, a supply that's outside of the air that would normally be breathed in from that atmosphere that's the person's in at that point. So when is a respirator necessary? A respirator is used when the levels of hazardous air or contaminants are could become higher than the exposure limit, and the exposure limit would be typically set by a regulatory agency, like OSHA or MSHA, or like Cal OSHA for a state-specific OSHA. It could also, some organizations or some companies have specific exposure limits that they won't tolerate their employees being exposed to above a certain level, or if the contaminants are unknown. So if you're going into an atmosphere, or if your employees are going to an atmosphere that maybe um, the contamination level is kind of unknown to them, that would be an instance when a respirator should probably be used. And then respirators, typically would be used when an engineering control isn't possible or isn't practical in an application. So those would be kind of generally times when it would be a good time to use a respirator. Different respirators for different hazards. So most everybody now, since again we're in kind of the COVID era, probably before COVID happened, a lot of people may have seen an N95 but not really know and haven't had an idea what it was called. Now I think most people have a pretty good idea of what an N95 is. A P100 would be similar, but basically an N95 is an engineered paper type respirator that does cover the nose and mouth. Those are available from a variety of different manufacturers. During the COVID era, like I talked about briefly earlier, NIOSH and OSHA did put temporary approvals on KN95s, and I believe those have expired. Those approvals for temporary use of those type of respirators. And the main reason for that was that, like, manufacturers like 3M or like Moldex, or any of the other main brands of N95 or P100, papered style respirators, um, had supply chain issues. They just didn't have, they weren't expecting COVID, so their supply levels were below maybe where they should have been, based on just running a business. Um, so yeah, N95s and P100s are basically particulate filtering and appropriate for dust, molds, bacteria, and viruses, depending again on what the exposure is. An N95 may not be sufficient, but a P100 may be effective when worn properly and when fit tested properly. Um, there's for an elastomeric type respirator, or a respirator that is actually, you can see kind of in on the right side of the screen, that's an elastomeric respirator. Um, that's a half face respirator. Actually, that's a full face respirator. That's just one that has goggle type of protection on it. But basically, there are various types of chemical cartridges available for use with half face and full face respirators. Um, and those different cartridges can provide protection from, again, organic vapors, acid gases, ammonia, and other types of contaminants that could be airborne and that employees or respirator wearers could potentially be exposed to. It is important to select the proper cartridge or filter for the hazard that an employee or employees could be exposed to. So, if they are working with VOCs, obviously they probably should be protected from those. So you'd want to choose a volatile organic vapor compound. Now, there are compound filters, so there's filters that can be used for various different types of contaminants. So, one cartridge might be able to, you know, provide P100, so particulate. So if there's high dust and also organic vapors, there are cartridges that have combinations. So, most manufacturers have a list of their different options that are available as far as the cartridges that they sell, as far as what are available to them, to their respirators. So if you do have a specific type of respirator, um, or specific brand, and you have specific contaminants that your employees or people that are wearing respirators could be exposed to, it's best to either reach out to the manufacturer directly or to the vendor that you purchased the respirator from, and just verify that the cartridges that you're selecting for your employees actually will filter out or be effective in keeping your people safe from the hazards that are present. Um, Air purifying respirators are typically only acceptable for atmospheres with 19.5 to 23.5% oxygen. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If the employee or the person wearing the respirator is going to be entering an atmosphere with insufficient oxygen, then a different type of an air supplying respirator must be used in that situation. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So to that point, an air supplying respirator really must be used in a highly toxic or low oxygen environment. So that's definitely something to also keep in mind is understanding the conditions and the situations that employees might be exposed to, and making sure that they have the proper type of respirator, whether it's air purifying or air supplying respirator or supplied air respirators. How do I determine the need for a respirator and who must wear one? So it kind of depends. Each industry or each application could be different. I've just listed a couple primary industries that we run into and that throughout my career I've kind of seen. So for healthcare, what situations essentially are your employees exposed to that might require a respirator? Are they, in an infectious disease department or working with patients that may have infectious diseases? And those could vary from, again, we're in COVID era, so COVID would be one that we have been trying to prevent spread of. So that would be a disease. It could be more benign, like a common cold or something like that, or tuberculosis, which is a little bit more of a virus that we want to try and prevent the spread of. Do the do the workers work in the emergency department? Are they in a surgical center that might require them to be wearing a respirator? And then again, we're in COVID era, so do they have potential COVID exposures from patients? There are other situations, obviously, in healthcare. From a non-clinical perspective. So if you have maintenance personnel or personnel that are not necessarily face to face with patients, they may fall more closely under the general industry standard if they're working with chemicals or if they're working with different situations that obviously again would not expose them to you know things that a healthcare worker like a doctor or a nurse or somebody working with the patient facing employees are working with. So that would be one that I would say, you know, healthcare facilities, especially hospitals, are very large facilities. So that would be one where you would want to make sure that you understand what the employee is going to be exposed to. So for general industry, which again could include portions of healthcare. Um, Typically, an air survey or air quality survey would, it would be helpful to be, conducted. And generally, in an air quality survey, an industrial hygienist will review SDSs of any chemicals or substances that are present that employees or staff might be working on or working with that may cause an exposure to be above the exposure limits set by OSHA or set by the company. And those type of surveys would typically, um, yield a report that would identify certain areas or work positions that may have exposures that would require a respirator. So, we would want to determine the potential exposures by employees, um, and that would help determine the need for respirators in specific areas, and then also help determine the types of cartridges or the style of respirator that would be necessary. So if somebody is, you know, working with, a type of solvent or something like that, they may, in a portion of the facility, they may need to wear a specific type of respirator with a specific type of cartridge, that might be, maybe it's a volatile organic compound cartridge. And then if you had another employee that was doing sanding of, wood or, anything, they may require a different type of respirator that might be, more of a P100 type respirator. So again, understanding, um, what your employees are exposed to is a pretty important part of understanding what type of respirators that might be needed in different areas of the workplace. For construction, um, basically understanding what types of tasks are being performed, whether it's cutting, breaking, if there's concrete or other dust issues, um, really understanding kind of what that work environment looks like. The thing with construction is that typically construction environments, it's not like an assembly line or a factory where employees are working in a pretty consistent, generally environment. Typically construction sites are dynamic and they're typically changing on a regular basis. So it's a little bit more difficult, but generally, um, especially on a construction site where there's dust, there's typically are exposures that could put your employees above the limit where they legally probably should be. So the use of a respirator may be needed, but that's something that needs to be looked at by either a safety professional or a company like ours or any of the hundreds of other companies out there that can do that type of analysis for you. Again, construction is dynamic, so each situation is going to be a little bit different, and it might be a little bit more challenging. But that's there are a lot of resources that are available to construction companies that can help identify which respirator would be sufficient. Other industries may require respirator use depending on potential exposures and activities being performed. Again, every organization is different. Every process is going to be a little bit different. So really fully understanding what exposures and what potential exposures your employees or people working for you may have is really going to allow you to fully understand what type of respirator and what type of cartridges, if you're using an elastomeric half face, full face respirator, should generally be used. So types of air purifying respirators, again, that's the respirator type, which I don't really, well, I guess we've got a few different here, but full face elastomeric respirators, that would be basically a respirator that, um, has cartridges and, that would be, one that is essentially gonna cover just the eyes and the nose and mouth. A half face elastomeric is very similar. The nose cup that you're going to find in a full face elastomeric is going to look very similar to a half face elastomeric respirator. Um, and basically, that's going to cover just the nose and the mouth typically. A filtering face piece respirator, that would be typically like an N95 or a P100, or there's a variety of different types of filtering face piece respirators. And then a powered air purifying respirator is a PAPR, and typically that'll If you look at the bottom right of the screen, it's hard to tell what type of respirators those are, but it looks like they've got full face respirators on the person in red. And then it looks like it's hard to tell what the guys in kind of the space looking suits are wearing. But basically, a PAPR has a filter that sits usually on the belt or like kind of like a backpack, and it typically runs air through the filter. And it is not tight fitting. So, one thing to keep in mind with powered air purifying respirators, generally, they don't need to be fit tested. Again, you want to verify that with the manufacturer. And most manufacturers, all manufacturers have instruction manuals that'll help you determine whether a fit test is needed. But the other types of respirators, the full face elastomeric, the half face elastomeric, and the filtering face piece type respirators, they are tight fitting to the face, so they do require an annual fit test. So do keep that in mind. Fit testing program. One other thing I will actually cover, so types of air purifying respirators. Um, there's also an SCBA that you see in the top right of the screen. That's what like firefighters or hazmat or SWAT teams may potentially use. That also is that's a respirator type that does require an annual fit test because it does have a face piece that is tight fitting. So those are typically supplied air respirators. So I don't have a slide for that, but do keep in mind that that would be the type of respirator that would require that. And then one other thing to keep in mind is if you have any question whether a respirator does require a fit test, again, either check with the manufacturer, look at the instruction manual that comes with the respirators, or consult a safety professional that can help guide you as to whether a fit test is actually required or not. Fit testing program. So a fit testing program is going to provide an employer the opportunity not only to train employees on proper use, but also keep their employees safe and also compliant with any regulations that are federal, state, or there are certain companies that have specific standards that go above and beyond what those are, what those agencies may require. So basically, before putting on a respirator, employees, have to inspect it every time. And this is not just during a fit test, but this would be at all times. So, checking for damage and contamination to the respirator. Not all employees are going to be wearing a respirator at all times or during their entire shift. They may be only using it once a week or once a month or maybe even once a year. So really understanding not only how to store that respirator, but also check for damage and and potential contamination that may have occurred since the last time they used it. And typical things that we typically like to look for would be, if it's a full face respirator, any cracks to the the plastic portion of the respirator that the glass piece or a lot of times it's plastic, making sure there are no cracks in that, making sure that head straps are have elasticity and aren't stretched out. Most respirators have a one-way valve or an exhalation valve, inhalation valve. So making sure that those pieces and parts are all in good shape, and making sure that the actual mask is not deformed at all. So sometimes what we see is we'll see people that store masks in a locker or in a storage area that may have other you know other PPE or other equipment that the employee or the person wearing the respirator may need. And sometimes that respirator, especially if they're not using it on a regular basis, may get you know other things put on top of it and can deform the general shape of the respirator, and that can cause a major issue. So want to make sure that we're going over that. Um, and making sure, I guess the other thing that is really truly probably one of the most important pieces is making sure that the sealing surface of the respirator it doesn't have cracks on it, doesn't have issues with it, and just making sure that it's being covered, and making sure that all those components are being covered during the fit test portion, of the year where the employee is coming in for their annual fit test. It gives the employer or the person that's administering the fit test the opportunity to go over all of these components and these important safety checks with the employee, and then also fully understand how to maintain that respirator so that it can be used, for the year to come, and make sure that employees are fully understanding, the importance of the respirator, and how it should be properly functioning. So quantitative versus qualitative. So again, there are two types of fit testing, two types of fit tests available. The main difference between quantitative fit testing and qualitative fit testing is that quantitative fit testing objectively measures the amount of leakage or the quantity of leakage in a respirator, while qualitative relies on subjectively um, exposing the respirator wearer or the user to a taste or a smell in order to detect the leakage of the mask, or no leakage in the mask, and if the mask is fitting properly. So, you know, qualitative, again, it's based really entirely on the ability of the participant to smell or taste the spray solution or a smoke solution. Um, it's completed using one of four solutions: irritant smoke, which is stannate chloride, Bitrex, isoamyl acetate, which is banana oil, or saccharin. Um, we as an organization don't use irritant smoke because it is poisonous. Once it hits your mucous membrane, it does kind of turn into an acid. So it's, out of the four of those, it's probably the one that I personally would recommend the least. Although uh, from a qualitative standpoint, irritant smoke, I believe, is the only type of qualitative fit test that can be used with a full face respirator. Um, Bitrex, isoamyl acetate, banana oil may be able to be used. I would have to get clarity on that, but Bitrex and saccharin really can only be used on a half face respirator or an N95 or P100 type of respirator. So, keep that in mind. Um, yeah, I guess one of the benefits to irritant smoke is it's very hard for people to fake. So, if they get a whiff of irritant smoke, they're probably going to cough pretty pretty badly, because it is a very irritating smell. Um, and so that would be one. Again, we don't use that with our customers, but there are organizations that do use it, and that's their choice. It is approved by OSHA. All four of those are OSHA approved fit testing methods. Um, we do use Bittrex and saccharin. We don't use banana oil. Banana oil is another one that there are some components that make it a little bit inefficient for companies like ours that are, operating at customer locations. To have that, you typically need a chamber or a larger device to keep that banana oil you know, in a confined space. So either way, those are some different options there. Um, so keep that in mind. Um, One other thing too is it depends on kind of the industry. So certain, especially if people have taken a qualitative fit test before, a lot of times they know, hey, if I say that I can smell or taste that flavoring, whether it's Bitrex or saccharin or irritant smoke, um, I may not have to wear the respirator. Maybe I don't have to do the task that requires that respirator. Vice versa, if certain organizations, hey, if I do smell it, but can't do the job, then I might get fired, or I might get demoted, or whatever it may be. So you're relying on somebody to tell you whether they taste something or whether they don't, or whether they smell it, and it just opens up that whole kind of can of worms there. So do try to keep that in mind from the qualitative fit test standpoint. Again, you're just relying on somebody else to tell you whether they are able to smell or taste that. One other portion to that would be, some people have more sensitivity to different smells and flavors. So, generally we see with smokers, they may have a harder time with the Bitrex. Also, if somebody's taken a sweet drink or had a piece of candy recently, within a few minutes before a fit test, and we're using saccharin, there could be issues with them, tasting that flavor in their mouth. So, a variety of different things that you know can cause issues with qualitative fit testing. So those are all things to bear in mind. As far as quantitative fit testing, um, we feel that it's a more precise test. It uses a machine instead of your sense of smell and or taste to determine whether there's a proper fit on the mask that's being used. There's a variety of different machines or a piece of equipment that are available. Machines like the TSI PortaCount rather, or the Accutech AccuFit 9000. Those are both condensation nuclei counters. So basically, it's got two tubes on those devices. One tube attaches directly to the respirator, and there's another tube that just takes a sample of the air that's in the ambient. So basically the air that if the person wasn't wearing the respirator that's in the room. And basically it just takes a ratio. It takes a sample of that air that's passed through the respirator. And sorry about that, dog's freaking out. Benefits of working from home. But yeah, so AccuFit and the PortaCount are similar. AccuFit is kind of it's basically the same technology. It's just a different company. Another option is the OHD Quantifit 2 or Quantifit. It's a controlled negative pressure device, so it pulls a suction on the respirator to determine whether there's a fit on the respirator. Again, both methods, quantitative and qualitative, are acceptable and widely used, and they're acceptable per OSHA. Our organization prefers quantitative fit testing, mainly because it's more accurate, it is quicker, and we find that test takers find it more comfortable during the test. So I'll go through a couple quick things there. So accuracy, generally when set up properly, controlled negative pressure, or excuse me, condensation nuclei counters or the PortaCount or Accutech, AccuFit 9000, they're going to be generally quite accurate. So they'll generally have, give me 1 second here. I'm just going to mute myself. All right. So basically, they are going to be more accurate. So recently, for the TSI PortaCount and AccuFit 9000, OSHA did approve what's called a fast fit protocol. So previously, the method of fit testing with the PortaCount was about a 7.5-minute test. I believe about a year and a half ago, OSHA did finally approve what's called a fast fit protocol, and it's a protocol that includes 4 different basically maneuvers, and basically those maneuvers are a slight bend at the waist for about 50 seconds, 30 seconds of either jogging in place or I want to say that's jogging in place, or I think it might be head side to side or talking. I'm not really sure. There's 2 different methods of it, but it depends on which type of respirator. But the fast fit protocol basically drops that fit testing time down to 2.5 minutes, and that is approved for all condensation nuclei counters, so PortaCount and AccuFit 9000, and it is quite a quick test. It's very, it's been vetted and approved by OSHA, so it is a very valid test, and it is approved for most states, I believe, that have their own state OSHAs. So like Cal OSHA or My OSHA in Michigan, or there's other state OSHAs that have approved it as well. And then again, it's more comfortable for the test taker. So with qualitative fit testing, there are people that have allergies to Bitrex or saccharin or some of the other types of testing agents. So keeping that in mind, there's nothing to taste. There's no subjectivity. It's just pretty, everything is pretty. That's pretty much, you just do the different exercises that the machine tells you to do. You breathe normally, and then you either get a pass or a fail. So again, that's kind of the reason that we like it, for, again, both the speed and accuracy, and then also the comfort of test takers.
Dan, may I interrupt
Benefits.
for just a moment?
Sure.
We had somebody that asked if the technology on the PortaCount, or I'm sorry, on the other instrument, if it's more accurate than the CNP.
You know, I it kind of depends. So I personally prefer. I guess I would say I'm a little bit biased. I did work for TSI, full disclosure. I prefer controlled or excuse me, condensation nuclei counters, because I personally think they're more accurate. Um, I one of the things with the QuantiFit is that typically, in order to get an appropriate fit on the respirator, um, the person does need to kind of hold their breath for a period of time. I have used both, so I'm familiar with both different types of systems. I obviously am much more familiar with the TSI PortaCount and AccuFit 9000, but um, when used properly, both are very effective at producing an outcome that either will verify a fit or verify a non-fitting respirator. So, the thing to keep in mind with all these type of fit tests, whether you're using qualitative or quantitative fit testing, is that you follow the OSHA guidelines for using the test, and then also follow the manufacturer instructions for setting up and using the fit test method that you're going to be using, whichever one you select out of any of those. So again, it really with all of these, setting up the test properly is going to be the way that you're going to get the most accurate. But both methods, CNC and CNP, can be accurate when used properly. And it really ultimately is up to the person administering the test to make sure that the test is performed properly. I guess one other thing I would say between qualitative or saccharin Bitrex, banana oil or irritant smoke is um, you're not using a machine, so the machine isn't saying, okay, this is the exercise for 30 seconds. um, when you're using the hood, like a 3M or an Allegro or Moldex hood that comes with a Bitrex or a saccharin qualitative fit test kit, um, it is a very specific test. I mean, each exercise is a minute apiece. There's a pre-set up period that you have to put the hood that comes with the kit on the participant's head without a respirator to determine whether they can taste um, the challenge agent, which in our case would be Bitrex or saccharin. If the person tastes it, there's a very specific procedure. I can tell you, out of probably the thousands of fit tests that I've seen, both qualitative and quantitative, I've seen many, 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 many more people do a qualitative fit test incorrectly than I have with a quantitative fit test doing that incorrectly. So, again, there's a lot of different, you can cheat anything essentially if you wanted to. It doesn't make sense to do that in any of these tests, but I understand from the standpoint of wanting to speed things along. I would say qualitative would be an easier way to speed things up. Um, but that would put you out of compliance if an OSHA inspector was to come in and ask your employees how the test was conducted, and they're like, oh well, they put it on my head, they put the hood on my head for 10 seconds, sprayed the challenge agent, and I said I didn't taste it, and that was it. That wouldn't really pass muster with OSHA, so you might find yourself in a bit of an issue. Whereas with both the QuantiFit and the PortaCount or AccuFit 9000, what the screen says is basically the exercise that needs to be done. It's very regimented. So again, that's kind of a long answer, but basically with both the CNP and CNC, they can both be very accurate when performed properly. I guess that's kind of where I'll leave it. So benefits to quantitative fit testing, we kind of already went through some of these things, but basically it's an automated procedure and allows more simple training and consistent administration of fit tests. And that's simple training both for the test taker and also the person administering the test. Basically, once a person's trained on how to use a PortaCount or a QuantiFit or an AccuFit 9000, um, that's it. I mean, there's not a ton of variety. Whereas with qualitative fit testing, there are some intricacies. Again, once you do it a few times, it doesn't change a whole lot, but the amount of times that the nebulizer needs to be squeezed can vary from test to test based on, the person being given the fit test, based on their response to, a portion, the beginning portion that I kind of went over a second ago. So it can vary from test to test. Generally, each exercise is the same amount of time. They're each a minute apiece. But there is more variety or variability there as far as qualitative goes. Another benefit to Quantitative is the fit test software with all three brands, both OHD, TSI, and AccuFit or AccuTech. They all come with a fit test software that allows for different reporting to be pulled, so you can see, who's coming due or who's past due for their fit test. You can see how many of what type of respirator, how many of what size respirator. You can, there's a variety of different pieces of information that can be put into the system that can allow you to pull a variety of different reports. So that's kind of something, especially for larger fit testing programs, that can be a beneficial thing to the administrator of the program. Let me see here. And also the reports, the fit test reports are automatically saved to the computer that's being used or to the device that's being used. So that's something else from a record keeping perspective that is sort of a nice thing about all three of the different quantitative fit testing devices. Again, as we kind of discussed, quantitative fit tests don't typically rely on an employee's sense of taste or smell. So, especially with COVID, actually, that's a question that we've received a fair amount is, well, what if somebody has COVID but either doesn't know it? Because one of the symptoms of not so much Omicron, but Delta and variants before that was a loss of sense of taste or smell. So sometimes that was something that we were kind of running into is like, well, what if the employee has COVID or has the long lasting effects of COVID and can't taste or smell? Like, how do we test them? Well, quantitative would typically be something that could be used for that. The other reason that we, typically like quantitative fit testing is all three different types of fit tests, whether or all three different brands, the TSI, the AccuFit, and then the OHD, they're all going to be faster than qualitative fit testing when qualitative fit testing is done properly. A qualitative fit test should take about 7.5 minutes as well for just the test. That's not including any of the pre-testing that needs to be done to determine whether the person can taste the challenge agent. So either way, the condensation nuclei counters or controlled negative pressure, quantitative fit testing is generally going to be quicker. CNC with the PortaCount and the AccuFit is going to be 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And I think the AccuFit is about 4.5 minutes roughly, but I haven't used it in a while, so I don't want to speak to that, but I believe it's around 4.5 to 5 minutes. And then, the bottom line too is quantitative fit testing really does simplify the administration of respirator fit testing programs. So that's something, a benefit to keep in mind as well. Managing a respirator fit testing program. So respirator fit testing is obviously a very important and in most cases required component of a respiratory protection program. So you do want to keep in compliance with that. It is typically in the top 10 cited violations per OSHA each year. So it is something that OSHA definitely keeps a very close eye on. A respiratory protection program is typically required when respirators are used in the workplace to help reduce exposures to biological, chemical, or particulate airborne contaminants. So again, it's important to do that fit testing to keep your employees safe from any of those contaminants that they could be exposed to. A successful program really does need to meet OSHA, MSHA, or state labor safety requirements and laws. And that is typically required. Basically, anybody who wears a respirator on the job really does have to have an annual fit test. There's not a whole lot of gray area there. And then successful respiratory protection programs should also help assure the respirator wearer that they understand the proper use of their respirator and under which conditions and what hazards might be present that they need to use that respirator in. So it should provide a bit of peace of mind for that. Why fit test again? OSHA and MSHA and then state OSHA does require it. Respirators need to seal properly to the wearer's face. If there are leaks, the contaminated air can and will enter the respirator through leaks, in the sealing surface, and the wearer could breathe in airborne contaminants, which in instances when it's something that is benign, is not, it may be just an irritant, or it may cause a headache or something like that, to a more, toxic substance, which could lead, in extreme cases, to death. So, um, you know, making sure that the person and the employees are wearing a respirator that is sufficient for the environment that they're going to be working in is really important. And fit testing can help ensure that they not only know how to use the respirator, but also understand the conditions to use the respirator and understand how to properly maintain their respirator, so that when they are in a condition that requires it, it's being used properly. And then fit testing also helps confirm that the selected respirator fits the wearer correctly, allows time to educate the respirator on proper use and maintenance of the respirator in use, and allows that too. Written respiratory protection program. So hazards, basically it's going to identify hazards present that may require respirator use, and a written program should include all of these. And then there may be, more things that, each individual organization may want to add to their program. And then you should also refer not only to your state Department of Labor, or OSHA, state OSHA, or MSHA or OSHA federal regulations to determine that you're covering everything in your written respiratory protection program. But it should also cover what types of respirators are in use at the facility or at the location or in the company, and why they were selected. It should provide respirator training, schedule, and usage requirements, such as cartridge replacement schedules, maintenance, and repair. One thing to keep in mind with cartridges is P100 cartridge it's a HEPA filter, so it's truly a filter. So when you're using a P100, it kind of is going to depend on how much exposure to dust and airborne contaminants are, basically being coming in contact with that respirator and basically filling it up, or causing it not to be able to filter properly. Whereas different types of chemical cartridges, they have a very specific timeline. So a lot of organic vapor cartridges have about a 3-month, maybe 6-month time that they can be used. And that's basically once the employee tears open the package and puts that respirator cartridge onto their respirator, the clock starts ticking. And that's typically because a chemical reaction is involved, or it's using like a charcoal filter or something, a carbon filter, something like that, that it's got a very specific timeline. So really referring to the manufacturer specifications for each filter, or each cartridge, is important, and should also be, that should be part of the written protection program as well. Fit testing requirements should be included as required by OSHA or other regulators, and then record keeping forms, available respirators. It's a good idea to, any respirators that are available to employees, keeping the instruction manuals is also a good thing to keep in mind and keep into that, include in that written protection program. And then any other pertinent information the fit test administrator or the fit testing program administrator feels is pertinent to the program, or that is required by OSHA. Why fit test? Well, pretty simply, to stay in compliance with OSHA, MSHA, or state agencies. That's probably the main one, from a regulatory standpoint, but really also too, to create a safe workplace that employees feel comfortable working in. If you have employees that are potentially exposed to toxic substances, or viruses, or whatever it may be, nobody wants to work in a workplace where they don't feel safe. So, keeping that in mind, and making sure that they have the fit test that's required, you know, by regulators, but then also, by your workplace, is really an important thing. And then again, also to kind of to the employee piece, the peace of mind knowing that your employees have the skills and training to properly wear the respirator, and it might just save their life. So that's kind of all I've got as far as the presentation goes. I did include a link here to OSHA 1910.134. Excuse me, that is the respiratory protection standard. There are tons of other resources available. One resource that's really, or one organization that does have, obviously they sell respirators, but they also have a ton of resources that are really excellent. Is 3M. 3M does have some really excellent resources available to people that are either involved in setting up a respiratory protection program or administering one. But also the OSHA website has, I mean, it has the standard, and it has a lot of, you know, different pieces and components that go along with the standard, whether it's, letters of interpretation on different, questions that are asked by, by people, in safety, or, it just has a variety of different resources. Our company is always a resource. Mobile Health Diagnostics is always happy to help customers and, people that may have questions. RAECO is a great resource as well. So there are a lot of resources available to, to people that may be setting up a program or running a program. But really, the bottom line is, and what I'll kind of leave you guys with is, whatever the standard is, or whatever type of fit testing you use, make sure that you do the fit testing properly. Because if you're not doing it properly, it's like the person that is going to be wearing the respirator without cartridges. Like, why would you even do that? What would the point of that be? So, making sure that if you're going to do qualitative fit testing, that's fine. It's an approved way to do fit testing, but really make sure that you understand how to fully do that fit test properly, and make sure that you're doing it properly. So that's where I'll
Thank
leave
you.
it.
We do have a few questions if you don't mind
Of
taking a
course.
few.
Yeah, of
Perfect.
course.
One is when a quantitative test provides the fit factor, how is that used if it's above the mask rating?
Yeah. So, basically, so a fit factor, there's typically two fit factors. There's 500, and that's going to typically be for SCBAs and full face respirators, and then 100 is going to typically cover N95s and half face respirators. Um, Basically, those are a minimum number that has to be achieved, and fit factors are calculated differently based on the type of device that's being used. So, a a fit factor is calculated via an algorithm with the TSI PortaCount, and also via an algorithm for the OHD QuantiFit. So I really couldn't go into the specifics of that, but if you do have specific questions on how the actual number is calculated, I would reach out to the manufacturer and they can provide additional clarity on that. But if, or I guess is a question, if the number is, if it's exceeding the minimum, so if it's, so say we're testing a full face respirator and the fit factor comes back at 4,000 and the minimum is 500, basically it just means that that respirator is fitting the person's face above, in exceedance of the minimum. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I don't know if that answers the question, but that would be kind of how I would answer it. I'm happy to take that one offline and talk to whoever that is if they want. We can get some additional clarity on that, but basically that's kind of how I would say that is, as long as you're hitting the minimum, so the 100 for half face or N95s or higher, or as long as you're at 500 or higher for SCBAs or full face respirators, you can be confident that that person has a respirator that's fitting their face properly and with minimal um, leakage.
Perfect. Okay. The next question is, what is your experience with conducting quantitative and filtering face respirators? My experience is the tubing may cause, I believe they meant the respirator to drop and cause failure.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So inherently, an N95 respirator, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative, is going to be generally more challenging, because it is, while it is a tight fitting, and I use that in air quotes, respirator, the straps, as anybody who's seen an N95 and then seen even a half face respirator, the straps are much less robust than, what would be found on an elastomeric or full face, half face respirator. But one thing to kind of keep in mind is that, especially when using the PortaCount. So one other thing to just clarify: the PortaCount and the AccuFit are the only type of quantitative fit testers that are capable of fit testing N95s or filtering face piece respirators, because of the technology. You can't really draw suction on an N95 with you know with one of the with an OHD QuantiFit. So typically, if you're connecting the tubing, while it's not heavy, it's still, to the person's point, can pull the respirator off of the face enough to induce a failure. So typically, the TSI PortaCount does come with a lanyard that can be attached to the tubing. I do recommend using that. But then also, if you don't use the lanyard, I would recommend having the person that's being fit tested hold that tubing so that there's some slack in the tube so that it's not pulling down on the respirator. And that is OSHA valid. It doesn't disqualify the test or anything like that. But that sometimes will have the ability to pass the fit test. One other thing to keep in mind is that N95s, generally, not on all brands, but most brands have a metal nose piece. And that's where we actually see the failure point a lot of the time, is because people don't push that nose piece down enough. So unfortunately, while respirators are a safety device, they're not necessarily 100% of the time created to be super ultra comfortable. And that's a bummer, but that's a piece of PPE. So sometimes PPE isn't going to be the most comfortable just because it is designed to protect you. So really adjusting that nose piece so it's very firm on the nose. And then also having a variety of different respirators available, especially with N95s. At least two is a good idea. And then typically, if it's a multi-size respirator, so if there's small, medium, large, having at least a small and medium available is a good idea. But it really is good to have at least two different brands of respirators. And again, I know with COVID, it was hard for people just to get their hands on any N95s, let alone multiple different brands. But we are moving hopefully out of the supply chain issues with N95s. And there's a lot of brands now that are either out now or available very soon that are manufactured in the US, and they're ramping up production significantly. So there's some really good options. And then there are certain facial profiles that, while it may seem like the tubing is pulling the respirator off, it may just be the facial profile of the person. Everybody's face is different, so there could be different situations there as well. But generally, I would say the short answer is have the person hold that tubing so that there's some slack and so that it won't be pulling off the face.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question since we're running out of time.
Sure.
Ben asked, is there such thing as a certified fit tester?
No, so like our company, we do audiometric hearing testing, and while it's not technically required, all of our technicians are KOC certified. That is a 2-day or 2.5-day certification course that people that are administering audiometric hearing testing do have to or should take. Respirator fit testing there isn't a certification course. There are training courses on how to properly do fit testing. The most kind of, I guess, common, like the probably the most well-known would be Dr. McKay, formerly with the University of Cincinnati. He does have fit testing courses periodically throughout the year, and they're very comprehensive. So if you do want additional information on how to properly fit test and how to do fit testing, Dr. Roy McKay is a very good resource and does have courses. TSI does have training videos, which I believe RAECO actually also has on their website. They're excellent as well. 3M does have resources as well that are very good, but there's no specific certification that's required. I believe the OSHA standard says anybody administering a respirator fit test should be trained on how to properly administer the test. It's kind of vague, but no, to the question, there is no specific requirement for a training per se.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan, so much for presenting for us today.
Of course.
If you have any specific application questions, feel free to give us at RAECO Rents a call at 866-736-8347. You can also reach us by email at webinars@raecorents.com. Dan, if you don't mind flipping to that last
Oh yeah.
slide, have our contact
Sorry
information
about
on.
that.
No, no worries. Um, Let's see here. So we put a lot of good technical tips on our website. So you can go to our website and we have at the top banner, you'll find something that says Training Center. And you can find a lot of these videos, especially the fit testing videos Dan mentioned are there. We do record all of our training sessions, which you can also find on our website under the webinar section. A copy of today's session will be emailed to you tomorrow, and a certificate for attending today's session will be emailed in about an hour from now after this concludes. Feel free to email us if for some reason you don't see that certificate. You can just email us at that webinars@raecorents.com and we'll get you taken care of. If there's any topics that you find interesting that you'd like us to cover, you can also email those suggestions to us. Watch your email for an announcement on our upcoming webinar that will cover perimeter dust monitoring. That should be coming out in the next week. And at this point, we will wrap things up and thank you again, Dan, for presenting.
Of course, and the one thing I'll leave everybody with is that this was not comprehensive. It's an overview. So, if you have questions, RAECO's a great resource. We're happy to be a resource to anybody. But definitely make sure that you're following the OSHA, standard. And yeah, appreciate everybody's time today.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.